Unlawful dissection of a body. That's what Bashid McLean now has to think about. And police believe he did not act alone while cutting up his mother. A friend, William Harris, has now been charged with the same thing. Both men are now sitting here inside the 4-0 precinct. The questioning far from over.
The screen lit up. It was a photo. Just one among dozens of detectives were scrolling through on a cracked Android pulled from the pocket of a 23-year-old man who sat silent in the next room. In the image, he stood in front of a bathroom mirror with one arm holding a smartphone, the other cradling what looked like a mannequin head. But it wasn't plastic. It wasn't part of a Halloween prank. It was real. The eyes were closed, the hair was matted, and the angle of the neck, twisted unnaturally, told the detectives everything they needed to know. The officers scrolled again, more pictures and more angles, her head placed in the sink, her limbs wrapped in plastic, and his expression unchanged. Someone whispered in the hallway, "What the hell are we looking at?" But everyone already knew. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a photo shoot, and when they finally asked him why, he didn't flinch. But this case had more twists than any blockbuster movie. Because just when everyone thought it was over, when the trial ended, the headlines faded and the prison doors closed, an even greater tragedy was already taking shape. And it would strike again. This time, it wouldn't be the mother, it would be an innocent child still connected to the same man. February 26th, 2013, the streets of the South Bronx were still mostly quiet. On Eagle Avenue, a man was walking his dog, following the same route he took every day before work. But this time, the dog kept pulling towards something on the sidewalk near the curb, a black trash bag, torn slightly open. The man pulled back on the leash, but the dog wouldn't let go. It growled, sniffed, circled again, and then he saw it just beneath the torn plastic. He thought it was a pig's carcass at first, maybe from a butcher shop, maybe roadkill, but the longer he looked, the more that theory stopped making sense. There were no butcher shops on this block, and pigs don't wear clothes. He stepped closer, lifted the edge of the bag and stumbled back. Inside was a human torso. He didn't waste another second. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. Police were on the scene within minutes, and when they saw what was inside the first bag, they didn't hesitate. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a medical waste dump. This was a body, and someone had tried to scatter it. They called for backup, cadaver dogs, crime scene technicians, and the search expanded block by block, spreading out across nearby streets, 156th Street, 158th Caldwell Avenue. And on every corner, they found more. Another bag held legs, one contained both arms, folded at the elbow, and stuffed into a suitcase. Then came the most chilling discovery. The head, still intact, still recognizable, and still wearing the same expression she likely had the night before she died. It didn't take long to realize these bags had been planted with intention. They weren't dropped randomly. They were spaced, placed, almost arranged. Whoever did this wasn't in a panic. They had a plan, and they were just getting started. The morning after the body parts were found, Bashid McLean walked into the 40th precinct in the Bronx. He moved slowly, calmly, as if he had just lost track of time rather than someone's life. He told the officers he wanted to file a missing persons report. His mother, Tanya Bird, hadn't come home. He said she'd left the apartment late the previous night. According to him, her ex-boyfriend had come to pick her up, and she hadn't returned since. The officers took the report, but they weren't the only ones listening. His half-sister, Portia Lovett, had already arrived at the station, and the moment she saw Bashid, something shifted. She stepped toward him and looked him in the eyes. She later told reporters, "I asked him what happened. He looked right at me and said, 'I did nothing wrong.'" But what stuck with her wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the coldness, and the certainty, because she knew something the officers didn't. Bashid hated their mother. He resented her rules, he despised her authority, and in recent months, he had grown more distant, more aggressive, and more strange. The family had been worried for a while, but they hadn't imagined this. Still, there were holes in his story, and they didn't take long to appear. Because when detectives followed up on that so-called ex-boyfriend, there was no record, no witness, no one had seen Tanya leave the apartment, no one saw a car pull up, and no one saw her alive again after 11 p.m. the night before. Then came the second red flag, Bashid's phone. Detectives asked to take a look, and what they found on that screen would not only unravel his entire story, it would turn a missing person case into one of the most gruesome murder investigations in Bronx history. Tanya Bird had spent most of her life in the Bronx. She was 45 years old, a home health aide who worked long shifts caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. But the person she cared about most was her youngest son. She lived in a modest apartment on Westchester Avenue, sharing the space with two of her children. Her eldest, 23-year-old Basid McLean, and her youngest, 7-year-old Nasir, who had Down syndrome. Neighbors remembered Tanya as joyful, the kind of woman who smiled through her struggles and always found a way to help others, even when she had very little herself. She'd bring groceries to an elderly tenant upstairs. She'd check in on people in the building if she hadn't seen them for a while. And even after a long day of work, she always had time for Nasir, who rarely left her side. She loved her boys deeply, but it was clear to those around her that one of them worried her. In the last few months, she had started expressing fear, quietly, cautiously, about Basid. Something in him had changed, she said. He was cold, distant, and sometimes angry for no reason at all. The officers made their way to Tanya Bird's apartment on Westchester Avenue later that same afternoon. The moment they reached the door, they noticed something off, but as the door opened, they were hit with the sharp, unmistakable smell of bleach. The scent wasn't faint or accidental, it was heavy, clinging to the air like a warning. Basid McLean stood in the doorway, calm and unbothered. He let them in without hesitation, and when they asked to see a photo of his mother, to confirm her identity, he nodded and pulled out his phone. But then he did something strange. Instead of showing them the screen, he turned it away, and when one of the officers leaned in, Basid tilted the phone even farther, shielding the contents like it held something more than just memories. That was the moment suspicion fully shifted. The officers began scanning the apartment, not searching, just looking. But what they saw was more than enough to raise an alarm. There were cleaning supplies stacked near the bathroom door, disposable gloves sat on the sink, and the shower curtain was missing entirely. The floor in front of the tub was damp, and the tiles had that unnatural shine that only bleach leaves behind. They didn't have a warrant yet, so they couldn't dig deeper, but they didn't need to. They left the apartment, filed their observations, and within hours, they returned with legal approval to search the premises. What they found inside changed everything. Tucked in the corner of the bedroom was a power saw, its blade still coated with residue. A shopping cart sat near the door, the same type spotted near one of the dump sites just the day before. Latex gloves were found under the sink, and on the floor of the bathroom, beneath freshly wiped tile, investigators detected traces of blood soaked deep into the grout. But the most chilling discovery wasn't physical, it was digital. Because when they finally unlocked Basid's phone and scrolled past the apps, the music, the ordinary selfies, they found a folder filled with images. Some were blurry, others were posed, but one photo in particular stopped them cold. In it, Basid stood in front of a bathroom mirror, his eyes half-lidded, and in his arm, cradled like something fragile, was the severed head of Tanya Bird. And it wasn't just evidence, it was intent. Because while the officers were looking for a missing woman, Basid McLean had already turned her death into a photo shoot. And that selfie, it changed everything. But investigators quickly realized he couldn't have done this alone, so when officers dug deeper, they found another man in the picture, someone with a long arrest record. William Harris was 26. He wasn't family, but he'd been close enough to the McLean household to move freely. Neighbors had seen him around before, but after Tanya Bird's body was discovered scattered across the Bronx, Harris found himself dragged straight into the center of the investigation. Surveillance footage confirmed it. There he was, caught on camera, pushing a shopping cart alongside Basid McLean, moving heavy bags in the early hours of the morning. They stopped at different street corners, and each time they left a bag behind. Police immediately picked him up, and when questioned, Basid didn't deny William's involvement, but he painted himself as the victim. He told officers, "I left to get some cash. When I came back, she was dead. William killed her. He told me if I didn't help clean it up, he'd kill me too. And Nasir." It was a disturbing claim, but it didn't explain the photos. It didn't explain the bleach or the missing shower curtain or the saw hidden behind the toilet. And it definitely didn't explain the fact that Basid had already filed a missing persons report days earlier, before Harris was even mentioned.
She always kept it simple, never out of turn or nothing like that. She's just such a graceful, beautiful woman. She's gonna be missed.
This case is turning into a classic one of he said. Sources tell Eyewitness News McLean and Harris blaming one another for the crime. Both have now been charged with unlawful dissection of a body.
Then came Harris's side of the story. He told detectives that Basid had boarded the train with him and, somewhere between stops, casually opened his phone. He showed William the images. Tanya's body was already cut up. She was already gone. William said he was shocked, but Basid begged him for help. He said, "I panicked. He was my friend." He looked desperate. So, William agreed to help clean up. He admitted to moving the bags. He admitted to being in the apartment, but he denied having any role in the killing. Prosecutors didn't charge him with murder, but they didn't let him walk away either.
It's too much. It's too much.
This is a first look inside Tanya Bird's building where police say she was killed in her second-floor apartment. Her son, Bashid McLean, with the help of a friend, William Harris, then allegedly cut up her body. Sources tell Eyewitness News surveillance tape then shows the pair carrying bags and suitcases out of the elevator and through the lobby, where a memorial now stands. Nathan Washington lives across the hall from Bird.
You never know about people. It's strange to happen.
The disturbing pieces of this puzzle, evidence in this case, police continue to find in Bird's home. Sources tell Eyewitness News pieces of a bloody mattress, a mop, and other cleaning supplies.
But as gruesome as the crime itself was, what haunted detectives even more was the growing sense that this wasn't just about what happened after Tanya died. It was about what came before, because long before the photo, before the lies, before the trash bags, there were warnings and no one listened. Basid McLean didn't come from a place of stability. His life had been fragmented from the start. He spent most of his early years in and out of New York's foster care system, shuffled between homes that offered temporary shelter but no real family. His mother, Tanya Bird, had struggled for years with drug addiction. She lost custody of Basid when he was young, and by the time they were finally reunited, he was already 18. But it wasn't the kind of reunion that healed old wounds. It was strained from the beginning. The years apart hadn't softened him. If anything, they had hardened him. By 2010, just 3 years before the murder, police had already encountered Basid in a violent episode. He attacked 2 officers with a knife during an altercation that ended with him in cuffs, and his mother trying to explain the outburst. Medical evaluations followed. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and doctors recommended immediate treatment. For a while, he complied, but it didn't last. He stopped taking his medication, and once he did, the changes weren't subtle. But the darkest warning signs came not from his words, but from his behavior around Nasir, his younger brother who had Down syndrome. Tanya began to suspect that something was wrong. She noticed how Basid would hover too close when Nasir was in the room. He'd get irritated easily, snap at the child, and sometimes just stare, without saying a word. Tanya once confided her fear to a relative, whispering that she wasn't sure Nasir was safe anymore. The family grew alarmed. They begged her to act. They told her, "He's dangerous. Get him out." But Tanya couldn't do it. She was his mother. And despite everything, some part of her still held on to the hope that things could get better. That if she just stayed patient, stayed present, stayed loving, he'd come back to her the way he was supposed to. She told them, "He's harmless. Don't worry." But behind closed doors, everything was breaking down. And soon, that breakdown would explode into something no one could ever take back. The fight began with a sentence. Tanya had reached her limit. She had watched Basid go deeper into anger, paranoia, and isolation. And that night, she confronted him. She looked him in the eye and said, "You're a bad father. You need to move out. Be a man." She turned in for the night, unaware that those would be the last words she'd ever speak. Sometime after 2 a.m., when the apartment had gone still and Nasir had curled up in his room, Basid got up. He walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and took out a knife. Then he entered his mother's room. He stood over her as she slept, and then, with no warning, he drove the blade into her neck. She never had a chance to scream. Nasir was still in the apartment, but somehow he didn't see it. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he heard and didn't understand, but either way, he survived that night without knowing what had happened just a few feet away. After the murder, Basid dragged her body to the bathroom and placed her in the tub. Then he called William Harris. Together, they went to a hardware store and purchased what they thought they needed to finish what had begun. rubber gloves, plastic bags, and a power saw. When they returned, they did their thing. And then one by one, they dropped the bags at street corners, Caldwell Avenue, 156th, 158th, never stopping for long. And then they went home, as if nothing had happened. The moment the evidence came together, detectives brought Basid back in, and then he said something no one saw coming. "If you can kill someone," he said calmly, "you should be able to cut them up too. If you can't, you're a coward." It wasn't a confession in the usual sense. It was colder, as if he had rehearsed it, not out of guilt, but pride. Detectives pressed further. They asked about the missing shower curtain, the one officers had noticed absent from Tanya's bathroom. He didn't answer, but they didn't need him to. The curtain had already been found, wrapped tightly around Tanya's remains, sealing in what little was left of her final moments. After that, everything moved fast. He was arrested on the spot and charged with second-degree murder. Harris, who had already confessed to helping clean up the scene, was arrested separately and charged with hindering prosecution and unlawful dissection of a human body. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the projector clicked on, no one was prepared for what they were about to see. On the screen was a photo burned into every investigator's mind. Basid McLean standing in front of a mirror, holding his mother's severed head as if it were a trophy. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Jurors looked away. Even seasoned court officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the defense didn't deny the image. They didn't even deny the act. Instead, they leaned on a familiar strategy: insanity. His attorney told the court, "Basid has been hearing voices since he was 10 years old. He didn't understand right from wrong. He didn't know what he was doing." They brought up his past diagnoses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. They pointed to his years in foster care, his unstable childhood, and his off-and-on relationship with medication. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They argued this wasn't a psychotic break. It was a calculated, cold-blooded killing. They reminded the jury that he filed a missing persons report, took staged photos, and dismembered the body using tools he had purchased just hours after the murder. This wasn't confusion. This was planning. And then came the family, one by one, testifying not just for Tanya, but for the years lost to fear, denial, and silence. Cassandra McLean, his aunt, stood and looked straight at him. "You're a danger to society. I don't hate you. I pity you." His father, James McLean, barely holding back tears, whispered from the witness stand, "I taught you how to walk, and you broke my heart." And finally, his half-sister, Portia Lovett, asked the question no one could answer. "Why did you take our mother away from us?" After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a single damning verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. And when it came time for sentencing, the judge didn't hesitate. 25 years to life. But even as the courtroom emptied and the cameras were packed away, those closest to the case couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over. Because sometimes the most painful chapters are the ones still waiting to be written. Everyone thought the story had ended with a prison sentence. The courtroom had emptied. The headlines had faded. The city had moved on. But the legacy of violence didn't die with Tanya Bird. It just shifted to the next generation. Zamair McLean was 4 years old. He was small, energetic, and full of life. He was also the son of Basid McLean. His mother, Zara Coombs, formerly known as Vera McLean, had once loved Basid, but by 2017, that relationship was over. She was now raising Zamair with a new partner and had just given birth to another child. It was a cold evening in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Inside their cramped apartment, Zara was juggling the chaos of 2 children, Zamair and his baby brother. She had cooked and cleaned, and then something small happened. Something that should have meant nothing. Zamair dropped an egg on the kitchen floor. That single moment snapped something inside her. Zara grabbed a broom and began hitting him, over and over, and when she realized he was unconscious, she panicked. Instead of calling for help, she placed his limp body into a plastic storage bin filled with cold water, hoping, somehow, that he would wake up. But he didn't. She didn't take him out. She didn't try CPR. She lay down beside her newborn and fell asleep. Hours later, her boyfriend returned. He walked into the apartment and found Zamair still submerged, silent and blue. He pulled him out and called 911. Paramedics arrived quickly. Doctors tried 3 times to restart his heart, but nothing worked. Zamir was gone. In the interrogation room, Zara broke down. She cried, stammered, and admitted what she had done. "I lost it," she told detectives. "I can't remember. I blacked out." And then she said something that stopped them cold. "He called me a chicken nugget. That's how he said he loved me." It was the kind of phrase only a toddler would say. Zara was charged with manslaughter. Her trial didn't last long. She was convicted and sentenced to 17 years in prison. The public didn't know what to make of it. Was it a coincidence? Or something darker? One generation had murdered a mother. The next had murdered a child. It was no longer just a case of madness. It was a cycle. A pattern of broken people, making broken choice and leaving behind broken children. By the time the prison gates closed and the headlines disappeared, there wasn't much left of the McLean family. The wounds went too deep, Tanya Bird was gone, and her grandson, Zamir, was gone. And Basid, her firstborn, was locked away, likely forever. But one person had survived all of it, Nasir. He was only 7 years old when his mother was murdered. He was in the apartment that night, just a room away, while it happened. He had Down syndrome. He didn't understand everything, but he knew something terrible had changed. His world had broken, and nothing would be the same again. Cassandra McLean, Tanya's sister, stepped in and took him. She became his guardian, his anchor, his only remaining family. And even though she tried to keep moving forward, the pain lingered. In interviews, she spoke softly but firmly about her decision. "I never want to see Basid again," she said. "Not in person, not in dreams, not even in memory." To her, the damage was too great to forgive. She tried to give Nasir a better life, a quieter one, free from shadows. But it wasn't easy. Every birthday, every holiday, and every nightfall, there were reminders. The neighbors remembered too. They still whispered when they passed the apartment, and social workers years later would quietly ask the same question the entire Bronx had once shouted: could this have been stopped? Could someone have seen it coming? Should Tanya have called the police sooner? Should the system have done more after Basid's prior arrests? Should anyone have listened to the warnings? But no one had answers. So what do you think about this case? What could have been done to prevent a tragedy like this? Let's have your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if you found this story important, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries. In 1999, during a quiet evening at home, Frank Gust sat across from his mother as she laid out tarot cards on the table. She had done this many times before, a harmless ritual that gave her comfort, but this night was different. When the death card appeared, she reshuffled the deck and dealt again. The same card surfaced a second time. Frank looked at her and spoke words that should have changed everything. He told her that he had killed a woman. It was not framed as a joke. It was not said in anger. It was delivered with a calm certainty that should have sounded like a confession. Yet his mother dismissed it as one of his stories, just another strange remark from a son she saw as troubled but harmless. What she did not realize was that her son was already responsible for a string of murders. Within months, police would confirm what she had brushed aside. Frank Gust was the man the press had already begun to call the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, one of the most disturbing offenders Germany had ever seen. Years later, when doctors asked him about his crimes, Gust gave an answer that was as chilling as the crimes themselves. He said he could never be treated, and if he was ever released, he would kill again. Now let's go back in time and revisit how it all began, because what you're about to hear is so disturbing and so detailed that it will leave you questioning how someone could descend so far. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Frank Gust was born on May 24, 1969 in the industrial city of Oberhausen in Western Germany. From the very beginning, his life was marked by absence and neglect. His father, an alcoholic, did not even come to the hospital for 3 days after his birth, choosing instead to spend what little money the family had in local bars. Only a few months later, his mother, Dagmar, filed for divorce. She was left with 2 boys to raise on her own, and Frank never saw his father again. Dagmar worked full-time to keep the household afloat, but that meant she was rarely at home. For a time, Frank's grandmother stepped in to look after the children, and her presence brought some stability. But when she fell ill, Dagmar had no choice but to place her young son in a nursery during the week. He was clothed and fed there, but it was an impersonal environment. There were no embraces, no warmth, no consistent figure to give him a sense of safety. Psychologists later argued that this separation from caregivers created a deep emotional wound, one that shaped the way he viewed human connection. In 1973, Dagmar managed to move the family into a small house. For a short while, Frank experienced what felt like a normal childhood. He especially cherished Sunday mornings when he could crawl into bed beside his mother. He would later say, "Life was good then." But those moments were brief, because when he started school, the outside world reminded him just how different he was. Frank was smaller and more sensitive than the other boys, and bullies quickly targeted him. The taunts and beatings became routine, but one incident stood out as especially cruel. Classmates humiliated him in a way that left lasting psychological scars, and from that point on, he carried a deep sense of vulnerability. When Frank was 8, Dagmar began a new relationship, and soon his stepfather moved in. He was a strict disciplinarian, a man who believed softness was weakness. The tenderness Frank had once shared with his mother vanished, and the home became a place of cold control. His stepfather searched him when he returned from school, mocked him for his failures, and punished him harshly for mistakes. Under this new regime, Frank became a bedwetter, a liar, and a petty thief, behaviors that child psychologists later identified as desperate cries for help. But at the time, no one came to his aid. But the cruelty at home was not the only damage shaping him. During this period, Frank often wandered to his grandmother's street when he needed distance from his stepfather. On one of those visits, he encountered an older man from the neighborhood who at first seemed sympathetic. That sympathy turned into exploitation. Frank was groomed, abused, and eventually introduced to other men who took advantage of him. It was a hidden trauma that he never spoke about, and none of his family suspected. The abuse only deepened his isolation and reinforced the cycle of secrecy in which his other compulsions thrived. Around the age of 8, he bought a guinea pig with his pocket money, hoping for companionship, but his stepfather, who claimed to be allergic, demanded the animal be removed. Frank pleaded with his grandmother to keep it at her house, but she dismissed it as a filthy rodent and told him bluntly to get rid of it. Most children would have let it go or returned it to the seller, but Frank reacted differently. He carried out what he was told in a way that revealed both cruelty and fascination, by crushing it. He would later say, "I like the feeling and the warmth when I reach inside the abdominal cavity." This wasn't horror for Frank, it was an awakening. From that moment on, he was hooked, and death and the acts that followed excited him. From then on, the urge would not leave him. It came back stronger, darker, and more demanding each time. Soon, he began slipping into gardens at night and taking rabbits. At first, he ended their lives quickly, but even that soon failed to give him the satisfaction he was chasing. He wanted more control over the moment and more time to indulge in the sensations that fascinated him. As he entered puberty, this cycle merged with his developing sexuality. The violence and his intimate urges became inseparable, feeding into one another. He no longer sought only to harm, but to dominate, and to draw out the process in ways that gave him both power and sexual gratification. He began collecting the remains of these rituals, storing them in containers, and sometimes immersing himself in them, as if creating a private world where he could return to the experience again and again. To him, this was not grotesque, but comforting, a way to escape from the emptiness he felt in every other part of his life. But like all compulsions, the effect dulled with repetition. The thrill began to fade, and rabbits were no longer enough. His imagination expanded to larger creatures. He later admitted that while he was still working with rabbits, in his mind, he had already killed dozens of horses. These fantasies became so vivid that they felt like rehearsals, building towards something he knew he would one day attempt in reality. Then, at 15, Frank walked into a youth home on his own and asked to stay there, telling the staff that he could not live with his family anymore. His mother gave her consent without protest, saying only, "You shouldn't stop travelers." It was a chillingly detached response that showed just how disconnected he had become from his family. Life at the youth home gave him freedom but little structure, and he spent more and more time wandering. He developed a fascination with cemeteries, often sleeping there when the weather was mild. Soon he began breaking into morgues. The smell of corpses, he would later say, was something he could not find anywhere else. He started tampering with the bodies, opening them up while pleasuring himself, and then multilated and staging them in ways that would shock those who discovered them. The compulsion was no longer about secrecy, it was about the effect on others. At the same time, he experimented with arson, setting small fires around his community. But that's not all. The thought of killing a horse stayed with Frank for years. Rabbits and smaller animals no longer satisfied the intensity he was seeking. He wanted something larger, something that felt significant. But there was also fear. Horses were powerful, and he worried about being injured if he tried. So in 1992, he took a step toward making the fantasy possible. He obtained a hunting license and began carrying a pistol regularly. By then, he was already spending much of his free time wandering through forests, killing rabbits, and detached from ordinary life and consumed by private urges and pleasure. He admitted later that his plan was precise. He wanted to cut open a large animal while it was still warm and to immerse himself in the experience for as long as he could. Eventually, he acted on it. One day he shot a horse, cut it open, then carried out the fantasy he had rehearsed for years. To him, it was not frightening. He described it later as calming, almost comforting, as though the reality had matched the idea he had carried in his mind for so long. But the fulfillment did not end the compulsion. Instead, it shifted it. Once he had crossed that line, he began to wonder what it would feel like to do the same to a human being. Then, on the evening of September 8, 1994, Frank Gust had been driving with no clear destination. Rain had started to fall, so instead of roaming the woods as he often did, he stayed behind the wheel. On a quiet stretch of road, he noticed someone ahead. A young woman was standing with her thumb out, hoping for a ride. Her name was Catherine Thompson. She was 28, originally from South Africa, and was trying to return to the Netherlands where she lived. When Gust pulled over, she asked if he could take her in that direction. He agreed, and she climbed in. At first, the ride felt normal. They made small talk, even shared a few light moments. Catherine had no reason to be afraid. Gust appeared calm, polite, almost ordinary. But beneath that exterior, his thoughts had already shifted. He realized no one had seen her get into his car. He had a weapon with him. The opportunity was there, and he began to wonder if this was the moment he had been waiting for. As he drove further, he turned off onto a forest track. He told Catherine he needed to stop for a moment to ease himself. Then when he came back, he told her that he had misplaced his key, so she had to step out of the car. Then when she was distracted, Gus shot her in the head. What happened next marked the transition from years of fantasy to his first killing. Catherine never left the woods alive. However, killing her wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. He then went to abs the corpse-esque Solly, then severing the hands and head. When it was over, Gust staged the scene in a way that ensured discovery. He left her body in a location where it would be found quickly, and he disposed of other parts separately, scattering evidence rather than concealing it. He wanted shock. He wanted investigators, bystanders, anyone who stumbled across the scene to be confronted by it. The next day, Catherine Thompson's body was discovered. The condition was so disturbing that it made national headlines. Newspapers described the case as one of the most shocking Germany had seen in years. The public was terrified. A killer was out there, and no one knew who he was. But Gust couldn't keep quiet. Whether it was guilt, pride, or a compulsion to be recognized, he told people what he had done. He confessed to his girlfriend Elsie, showing her Catherine's identification card. When she doubted him, he took her to a spot where he had buried some of the remains. Even then, she dismissed it. She convinced herself it was a twisted prank. When she later told friends what Gust had said, they laughed it off as well, insisting it was too bizarre to be true. They thought the evidence came from a doll. He also told his mother. During one of her tarot readings, the death card appeared. Gust took it as a sign and admitted he had killed a hitchhiker, but he softened the details, telling her it was an accident, that the woman had found his gun, and in a struggle, it went off. He said he left her in the woods. His mother brushed it aside, saying, "You always tell such stories." She later mentioned it to her boyfriend, a police officer. He too dismissed it, calling it attention-seeking. So Gust carried on. He had confessed to his girlfriend, to his mother, and even to a policeman, yet no one believed him. He was practically begging to be caught, but because of who he was, quiet, meek, seemingly harmless, no one imagined he could be responsible for something so brutal. But Catherine Thompson's murder was only the beginning. Not long after Catherine Thompson's murder, Frank Gust's outward life seemed to take a very different turn. He met a young woman named Rolfe, sometimes referred to in accounts as Ruth. She worked in a small local shop, and their first conversations were unremarkable. To her, Frank appeared quiet, perhaps a little unusual, but not threatening. Despite his withdrawn demeanor, she found him attentive, and before long, they were a couple. The relationship moved quickly, they married, and within a short time, they had a daughter together. Gust secured steady employment as a roofer, and on the surface, he looked like a working-class husband and father. Neighbors described him as dull, a man who kept to himself, someone they rarely noticed. He blended into the background of everyday life, giving no outward sign of the compulsions that still consumed him, because those compulsions had not gone away. Behind closed doors, Gust continued to kill animals, ranging from small creatures to farm stock. These acts had become an outlet, a way of temporarily managing urges that otherwise threatened to spill over, but it was only temporary. Each time, the old fantasies returned, stronger than before. He admitted later that even in moments of intimacy with his wife, his mind drifted elsewhere, back to Catherine, back to the aftermath of his first killing. It was as though the double life he was trying to maintain could never truly hold. By 1996, the tension had built to the point where animals no longer satisfied him. He wanted to act again. That year, he drove into Essen's red light district, where he encountered a 30-year-old woman named Svenja D. She entered his car, not knowing that she had stepped into the path of a man who had already decided what was to come. Gust later said he had not chosen her specifically. She was simply the one who got into his car that night. He drove them to a secluded area on the outskirts of the city. From there, the pattern followed what investigators would later recognize as his signature. He killed her and then staged her remains in a way designed to shock whoever discovered them. He placed her body where it would be quickly found, ensuring the impact would be immediate and unforgettable. The next day, her body was discovered near a roadside. What investigators saw bore striking similarities to Catherine Thompson's case 2 years earlier, a young woman murdered, then arranged in a deliberate and disturbing way. The parallels were impossible to ignore, but despite the clear connection, investigators had no suspect. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence strong enough to point to an individual. All they had was the pattern, and the chilling realization that someone in the region was killing in a calculated, ritualistic way. And Frank Gust, the quiet roofer, husband, and father, carried on with life as though nothing had happened. By the late 1990s, Frank Gust's fantasies had grown darker than ever. Killing was no longer enough. He began imagining ways to prolong suffering, to design scenarios that were more elaborate and more extreme. Investigators would later find files on his computer where he had listed out items for what he called projects: duct tape, cable ties, handcuffs, gloves, sharp tools, all neatly organized as if he were preparing for an experiment rather than a crime. He also turned his attention toward explosives. He bought materials and tested them on animals, but in his mind, he was already imagining people. He later admitted that when he carried out one of these tests, he wasn't talking to an animal at all. In his imagination, it had been a woman in front of him. This shift in his thinking revealed just how far he had drifted from reality. By June of 1998, Gust was ready to act again. On the night of the 20th, he drove into the red light district. That was where he met a 26-year-old woman named Sandra W., who agreed to get into his car. At first, he treated the encounter like any other transaction. He asked if she would let him tie her up. Reluctantly, she agreed, believing it was simply part of a client's request. But for Gust, it was something else entirely. Once she was restrained, his behavior turned threatening. He whispered disturbing things, telling her what he wanted to do, describing in detail the torment he imagined. Sandra, unable to move, realized too late that she was in the hands of someone who saw her as more than just a victim. He saw her as a canvas for his fantasies. Then something unexpected happened. In the middle of the ordeal, Gust paused. He even pressed his gun to his own head and told Sandra to pull the trigger. She refused, frozen in fear, desperate only to escape. Moments later, he untied her and told her she could go. Sandra bolted from the car, thinking she had been spared. But before she could get far, Gust raised his weapon and ended her life with a single shot. This time, the aftermath was different. Unlike the previous cases, there was less staging, less mutilation. He removed her hands, but the rest of her body was left largely intact. Some investigators later speculated that perhaps he had already satisfied his compulsion during the encounter itself. Others wondered whether guilt, rare for Gust, might have influenced his decision. Whatever the reason, the pattern was clear. A serial offender was operating in the region. When Sandra's remains were discovered by the roadside the following day, the brutality and the precision of the crime left no doubt. Police connected the murder to the earlier killings, and for the first time they publicly acknowledged what had been growing clearer with each case. A serial killer was targeting women across the Ruhr area. The press gave him a name, the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, linking him to Jack the Ripper not only because of the violence, but because of the deliberate way he left his victims to be found. By then, fear had spread through the community. Women were warned to take extra precautions. Investigators scrambled for leads. But Gust, the quiet roofer and family man, still lived undetected in plain sight, preparing for whatever came next. 1998. Frank Gust's double life seemed, at least on the surface, steady. He was married, raising his young daughter, and working as a roofer. That year, he and his wife moved into the home of her aunt, a 47-year-old woman named Gerlande N. She had recently gone through a divorce, and the arrangement looked practical, one family offering another stability. But inside the house, there were rules. Gust claimed the basement as his own space, and he kept it locked at all times. No one else was allowed to enter. To the rest of the family, it was simply accepted. To investigators who would later study the case, it became clear that this was his private world, hidden in plain sight. Over time, Gust grew closer to Gerlinde. They talked about personal struggles, and in those conversations, he decided to share more than anyone expected. He confessed to her that he had killed before. He described what he had done to women and how those thoughts never left him. For Gerlande, it was a shocking revelation. Some believe she urged him to go to the police. Others suspect she threatened to report him herself if he refused. Then, suddenly, she was gone. Gerlinde disappeared without a trace. Her friends and relatives reported her missing, but at first, police believed she had simply walked away from her life. After all, she had been under stress from her divorce, and there was no immediate evidence of foul play. Behind the scenes, though, Gust had already told a different story. He later admitted to killing her, but his accounts changed repeatedly. At one point, he claimed she wanted to die, and that he had only helped her end her life. At another, he said he dismembered her and left her remains scattered in the forest. No clear version ever emerged, and her body was never recovered. The disappearance of Gerlinde N. marked a turning point. Until then, Gust had hidden in the shadows, dismissed as unlikely whenever hints of his crimes surfaced. But now suspicion was drawing closer. The quiet roofer who blended into the background was suddenly linked to a missing family member. Investigators could no longer ignore the signs. By 1999, Frank Gust's secrets had been festering for years. He had hinted at his crimes to his girlfriend, his mother, and even to her partner, a police officer. Each time, his words were brushed aside as exaggeration or fantasy. But then, one small conversation finally tipped the balance. That year, Gust's mother, Dagmar, shared something unsettling with her daughter-in-law, Daniela. She repeated the tarot reading moment from years earlier, when Frank had drawn the death card and casually admitted that he had killed a woman. Dagmar had dismissed it at the time, but now, speaking to Daniela, she repeated the story. Unlike others, Daniela took it seriously. She decided it was time to act, and she went straight to the police. Detectives moved quickly. The Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, as the press had begun calling him, had terrified the region, and authorities were desperate for leads. They visited Gust at his home and asked him for a DNA sample. At first, he refused. Then, almost as though he had been waiting for the moment, he looked at the officers and said, "There is no need. I am the man you are looking for." With that statement, the mask finally slipped. Gust was arrested in 1999. When investigators searched his basement, the locked room no one else had been allowed to enter, they found what they had long feared. Tools consistent with his crimes, explosives, detailed notes cataloging his violent fantasies. It was the private world he had kept hidden, now exposed in full view. In custody, Gust gave a formal confession, but even then, he insisted on conditions. He demanded that his wife be present as he admitted to the murders. It was a strange request, part control, part performance, and it left investigators convinced that even in confession, Gust wanted to dictate how his story was told. By the time he finished speaking, there was no doubt left. The quiet roofer, the husband and father who neighbors thought of as dull, was in fact the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper who had haunted the region for years. In August 2000, Frank Gust finally stood before a jury court in Duisburg. The trial drew enormous attention. For years, investigators had chased the faceless Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, and now the man behind the name was sitting in full view of the public. From the start, Gust's behavior was striking. He asked for the death penalty, a punishment that had long been abolished in Germany. He said openly that he did not deserve to live outside confinement. To many, it sounded less like remorse and more like a grim acknowledgement of who he was and what he would always remain. Psychiatrists who examined him faced a complicated picture. They found diminished responsibility due to psychological disorders, but not to the extent that he could escape accountability. Gust knew what he was doing, and he understood the consequences. He was therefore fully responsible for his actions under the law. On 21 September 2000, the verdict was delivered. Frank Gust was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court also ordered him to undergo therapy while in custody. It was seen as a way to manage his dangerous impulses, perhaps even to find out whether he could be treated at all. But within 6 months, Gust refused to continue. He told doctors he was not treatable and that therapy was pointless. More chillingly, he said he should remain in prison for life because if he were ever released, he would kill again. It was a rare case where the offender himself was insisting that freedom was too dangerous. With that, Gust was transferred into the general prison system, where he remained under strict security. The trial was over, but the fear he created lingered. Germany had placed him behind bars for life, yet questions remained about whether even life would truly be enough. After his sentencing, Frank Gust was transferred to JVA Wörl, a high-security prison in North Rhine-Westphalia. It was there that he began the long life sentence imposed by the court. At first, his wife remained in contact, but the marriage could not survive the reality of who he was. Eventually, she divorced him and moved on. Gust, however, did not stay alone for long. Through letters exchanged from prison, he developed a new relationship and later remarried, once again binding someone to him from behind bars. Even in confinement, Gust never denied what he was. In interviews, he spoke with unsettling candor. "These thoughts never leave you," he told psychiatrists and journalists alike. Then, in 2020, he was granted escorted day release, a tightly controlled form of leave where prisoners are allowed outside under supervision. The decision sparked concern among the public, especially given his own admissions about being unsafe. Authorities justified it as part of Germany's gradual reintegration process, but many questioned whether someone like Gust could ever truly be reintegrated. Today, his future remains uncertain. His release date is scheduled for 2026, but German media have only reported that parole applications exist, not that a firm decision has been made. What is clear is that the debate continues. Should a man who once said he could never be treated, and that he would kill again if freed, ever be allowed to walk the streets without supervision? So what do you think about this case? Should someone who openly admitted that his urges never left him ever be given another chance at freedom? Or are some offenders simply too dangerous to reintegrate into society? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. We really do read every single one. And if you found this story as unsettling as we did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more true crime cases told in full detail. Until next time, stay safe.
Rosa, just 13 years old, is seen here and appears to be standing over mother Irina Garcia, who's in bed. Police say he stabbed her to death while she was sleeping with her 14-day-old baby asleep in the crib next to her. Less than 40 minutes earlier, take a look. This image shows Garcia in bed holding that newborn baby. And in this photo, we presume was taken after the alleged attack, showing Rosa posing with blood-covered hands.
This is the disturbing murder of Irina Garcia, a mother killed by her own son, Derek Rosa. But what drove a seemingly innocent boy to commit such a horrific crime? What turned a bright honor student into a killer? And why did a son murder his mother with nothing but the cold detachment of a child playing with a toy? Stay with us. This story is about to unravel in ways you never saw coming. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Derek Rosa, at just 13 years old, was known to everyone as a bright and promising honor student. His spotless record spoke volumes. Never a hint of trouble, always polite, always considerate. His family, his friends, and even his teachers all spoke of him with pride, describing him as a loving child, a boy with a sharp intellect, someone who excelled in school and never caused a scene. But behind that perfect exterior, something darker was unfolding, something no one saw coming, least of all his own family. His mother, Irina Garcia, was a dedicated woman. Just 39 years old, she had devoted her life to raising her two children, Derek and her newborn daughter. She was a mother who would go above and beyond for her family, often putting her own needs aside to ensure her children were cared for and loved. Her life was full of warmth, routine, and the kind of quiet sacrifice that only a mother truly understands. Yet, on the evening of October 12, 2023, that life would be tragically cut short, leaving a void that no one, least of all her children, could comprehend. Then there was Frank Ramos, Derek's stepfather, a truck driver who spent much of his time away from home, on the road. He was out of town when the crime occurred, making his absence a painful twist in the tragedy. Frank had been part of Derek's life for years. Though they weren't blood, Frank had stepped into a fatherly role in Derek's life, providing support, guidance, and care. It's unclear what Frank's exact relationship with Derek was like in the moments leading up to the murder. And despite the divorce, Derek's biological father remained a part of his life. Though separated from Irina, he still kept in touch with Derek, maintaining a connection, albeit a distant one. It was just another evening, seemingly like any other, in the small apartment where Derek and his mother, Irina, lived. That night, Frank was at work driving a truck, but Irina was at home, sitting in the living room, breastfeeding her newborn daughter, while Derek moved in and out of the apartment, a typical teenager with an air of impatience, like many others his age. The exchange they had was simple, almost mundane. As Irina looked up, she caught Derek heading toward the door, and with a soft but firm voice, she reminded him, "Don't run out the door, Derek." She said it with that maternal tone, the kind that's second nature to a mother trying to keep her children safe. Derek, likely frustrated by yet another small restriction, muttered something back, but that was the end of the conversation. But beneath the surface of these small, everyday moments, something far more disturbing was unfolding.
13-year-old Derek Rosa on doorbell camera. His mother holding her newborn baby, cautioning her teen son not to run.
Okay.
He asks her in Spanish why she always tells him not to run. Seconds later, he re-enters the apartment. Irina Garcia still in the same chair with her baby.
In the hours leading up to that fateful night, Derek's Google search history told a story that no one saw coming. At first glance, these searches seemed like the random musings of a curious teenager, but when viewed in context, they were more than that. They were the signals of a young mind consumed with the thought of violence, and the disturbing intention to follow through. Derek had typed in, "artery image diagram." He was not just curious about the anatomy of the body, he was looking for the places where he could inflict the most damage. Then came, where is the best place to stab someone? Next, is a small knife good for killing? And then came, can a knife cut through bone? The chilling realization set in, this wasn't an act of sudden rage or a moment of impulsivity, it was the culmination of hours of thought, of planning. Derek wasn't a boy who snapped in the heat of an argument. He had thought about every detail. And then there was the murder weapon, the tool that would be used to carry out the horrific act. Derek selected a 12-inch stainless steel kitchen knife with a pink handle. It was 11 p.m. Irina and her newborn daughter were asleep, unaware that this night would be their last. Derek, having waited for what felt like the perfect moment, finally moved. Derek slipped from his room. He approached his mother's bedroom. Derek pushed the door open, slipping quietly into the room, and then stood over her for a moment, with the knife gripped tightly in his hand. His eyes darted over her face, and then, with a sudden, chilling clarity, he whispered the word maricona, a slur in Spanish. He leaned over her, and with a swift motion, plunged the knife into her neck and severed the blood vessels in her neck. Irina's eyes flew open, but the pain was immediate. But Derek didn't stop. He was relentless, pushing the knife into her again and again and again, 46 times. Despite the screams of his mother, the chaos of the moment, his newborn sister slept peacefully beside them. But Derek didn't care. He was focused on what he had come there to do. The world around him, the pain, the blood, it all felt like a blur. In a sudden shift of focus, Derek turned away from his mother's body. His thoughts shifted, and instead of the immediate aftermath of his crime, he turned to something else. His online friend, Sweden. He reached for his phone and dialed, his fingers shaking, but his voice still calm. "I did it," he said without emotion, as though it were just another conversation. He sent a selfie, his hand covered in blood, holding it up proudly. The image was chilling, his face nonchalant, his tongue sticking out, the bloodied hand a grotesque testament to what he had just done. But then, the next step was almost inevitable. Derek had considered ending his life, his thoughts drifting toward the gun in the living room, but somehow, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he called 911, and in a voice that remained surprisingly calm, he confessed. But that, too, was a revelation of its own. A moment that would haunt everyone who would later hear those words.
Excuse me.
¿Quieren que lo podemos ayudar?
Can we speak English?
I speak English. How can I help you?
Could you bring the police over here where I live?
What is your address?
I don't know my address.
Are you by yourself with your mom?
Yeah, no, my baby sister's here too. She's sleeping.
Did you kill your mom? Okay, where is the knife right now?
I put it, let me check. Wait. I put it on the floor inside of the... Wait, no. Where is it? I can't find the knife. My what?
Your stepfather.
No, he's a truck driver, and he's driving trucks far away.
And do you have guns in the house?
Only one, but he has another one with him.
Okay, so you have a... Where's the gun right now?
It's in the living room. I loaded it. I pulled back the slide, but I did not shoot.
Okay, the gun is locked or it's in the living room somewhere?
Yeah, no, I have it right here on the couch. Do I get rid of the bullet? Not shoot it. Pull back the slide.
Do not touch anything. Okay, leave everything how it is.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I need to know that you don't have any guns or any knives with you.
There's a knife in my room and there's a gun in the living room.
Okay, I need you to stay away from them. Can you put them in a safe place away from where the officers can see them? Can you put them away?
So where do I... Shit, I'm sorry. I saw something fell and it scared me. I'm sorry, miss.
What happened?
Something fell from my mom's room and it scared me.
Something fell from what, sir?
It was, she has a lot of handbags and one of her handbags fell.
Okay, not a problem. I need you to put everything away, okay? I don't have anything in your hand.
Okay, but can I have my phone in my hand?
You can have your phone in your hand, yes, you can. I need you to stay with me on the line, okay? Do not hang up, okay?
Okay. Do I stay in the living room with the gun or no?
No. Do not touch anything. Do not touch anything. I don't want you to have anything in your hands, okay?
Okay, do I drop the mail?
You can put the mail to the side. Just have your phone with you, okay? Just stay with me on the line. Where is your sister? Your sister still there?
She's sleeping.
She's sleeping, okay.
Yeah. Excuse me, miss, what do I do if she wakes up?
If you wake up, just let me know. I need to know, do you think we can help your mom?
Miss, she's dead. And my stepdad's calling me. Do I answer?
No, stay with me on the line until the officers get there, okay? I'm sending you help.
Okay. Miss, do I sit in the living room or not?
Stay in the living room. Stay there where you are. Do not touch anything else.
I have more family members. They can take care of my sister.
I understand. Your sister will be in good hands, okay? Let's just worry about you now, okay?
Okay. Miss.
Yes.
I took pictures and I told my friends about it. Was that bad?
You told who about it?
My friends.
Your friends? Did you send pictures to your friends of what you did?
Yeah.
No, do not leave. Do not leave. Stay there where you are in your apartment. I'm going to tell you when you can come out, okay? Do not have anything in your hand, okay?
I'm gonna stay in my living room.
Stay in your living room. Only have your cell phone, okay? Stay with me on the line.
Okay, miss. Miss, I touched a lot of things in the house. Is that bad? Was that bad?
That's okay. That's not a problem. Okay? That's not a problem. Just stay with me on the line, okay? Why did you do this to your mom? Can you tell me why?
My stepdad's calling my mom. I can hear the phone.
Okay, do not pick up the phone. Just stay with me on the line. Concentrate, okay? Stay with me. Do you need fire rescue? Are you hurt?
No, I'm not hurt. I just have a little bit of blood on my hands at night.
You have blood in your hands?
Yeah. Miss, how did the police get here so fast?
Because this is a life-threatening emergency. So we get to places fast. We're there to help you, okay? We're gonna help you and your sister, okay?
Okay.
Who did you send us pictures to?
My friend. I don't know his real name because he is an online friend who I play with a lot.
When the police finally arrived at the apartment, it was already too late to stop the horror that had unfolded within its walls. But Derek, despite the chaos in his mind and the violence he had just committed, was eerily calm. The murder weapon, a 12-inch stainless steel kitchen knife, was found exactly where Derek had said it would be, on the floor of his mother's room, discarded after the horrific attack. But that wasn't all. The police also reviewed the Ring doorbell footage, which had captured Derek moving in and out of the apartment in the hours before the crime. Inside the apartment, the scene was as horrifying as anyone could have imagined. Irina Garcia lay in the room where she had been murdered, her body covered in 46 stab wounds. The brutality of the attack was evident in the sheer number of wounds. Then Derek was brought in for interrogation, and he was read his Miranda rights before they could proceed, and he also signed that he was willing to take the interrogation without a lawyer. At 13 years old, Derek sat across from detectives who were prepared to peel back the layers of a horrifying crime, trying to understand how a boy so seemingly innocent could commit such a heinous act. The interrogation commenced at 2:15 a.m. in the morning by the next day. The first major point was to determine the role of the online friend in the murder.
I decided to call my friends to tell them what happened, and then I said goodbye to my friends.
You called them before you decided to try to shoot yourself, or afterwards?
After.
Okay. How many friends did you call?
Only one.
What's his name?
I don't know his real name. He's an online friend.
He's an online friend?
Yeah.
When you say online friend, what do you mean, from video games?
Yes, from video games. I know him real well.
Okay. How long have you known him?
Since like I was 10. 3 years.
3 years?
3 years.
Have you ever met him?
No, I've seen the face.
You seen his face?
Yeah.
So how did you communicate with him?
My cell phone.
Through your cell phone, so you have his number?
Yes.
And you don't have him stored under a certain name, or you have him stored under a gamer tag?
I have him. I made up a name for him.
You made up a name for him?
Yeah.
What name did you make up for him?
Sweden.
Sweden?
Sweden. SWEEDEN.
Okay. How often do you talk to Sweden?
Every weekend.
Every weekend?
Yeah.
Okay. So you called Sweden. And what did you tell Sweden?
Told him what I did.
What exactly did you tell Sweden when you say what I did? Did you tell him how? Or no? How you killed her or no? Okay. Did you send them any pictures?
Yes.
How many pictures did you send them?
I sent him 2 of my mom and 1 of me.
Okay. Did you... What did he tell you?
He said he couldn't believe it.
Okay. Does Sweden live down here in Florida?
He lives real far.
Real far?
Yeah. In America though.
In America?
Yeah.
Okay. So then you hung up the phone?
I said goodbye.
Okay. And then what did you do?
I was going to show myself, but I decided I didn't want to do that, and I called 911.
But it was established that this friend has no part in this crime, so the officers have to question further, perhaps to know why he actually committed the crime.
Did you ever make your way to your sister?
Killing her?
No.
Touching her?
Touching her?
No.
No?
I left her alone. She was sleeping and she didn't wake up, so I didn't touch her.
Okay. All right. Let's get back to your mom. You purposely went for the artery? Was there a lot of blood after? And then she woke up?
Yes.
Did you say anythanything else to her? Or did she say anything to you or no?
No, she just screamed.
She just screamed?
Yes.
Okay. Why did you stab your mom?
Can I go to the bathroom before I answer that?
Yes, of course.
So you were about to tell me the why. Why did you kill your mother? Do you know?
Do I have to say it now?
Yeah, get it off your chest. Absolutely.
Can I wait for a lawyer?
Okay, at this point, you want a lawyer?
Maybe not.
We can't. No, listen. Just so you understand, okay? You have mentioned or asked us, should you wait for a lawyer? We're not here to advise you on whether to talk to a lawyer or not, but if you are requesting a lawyer at this point, we can't interview you any further. You understand? We have to stop the interview.
Okay.
Do you want us to stop the interview?
After Derek's confession and his arrest, the legal proceedings began to unfold at an alarming pace. Derek, still a child, now found himself facing charges that would typically be reserved for adults, as prosecutors moved to charge him with first-degree murder. Despite his youth, the law didn't treat Derek with the same leniency that might be expected for someone his age. He was charged as an adult, which meant that, as the case moved forward, the full weight of the justice system would be brought to bear on him. As the case progressed, experts were brought in to assess Derek's mental health, and what they discovered only added complexity to the situation. Derek was diagnosed with ADHD, and there were signs that he might also be on the autism spectrum, though this was not definitively confirmed. These findings prompted a wave of debate about how his mental health could have influenced his actions. Could his impulsivity, his inability to fully understand the consequences of his actions, have played a role in the brutality of the crime? Despite his age, he was transferred to a juvenile center, but not like any other young inmate. Derek, at just 13, became the youngest inmate among 34 other teenagers, all aged between 16 and 17. The stark contrast between Derek and the older, more hardened individuals in the facility was intense. And given the high-profile nature of his case and the very real concerns about his safety, the decision was made to place him in solitary confinement. He was isolated from all the other juveniles, held alone in a cell with only a frosted glass window for company. His days consisted mostly of silence, his only interactions being with the guards who watched over him. His confinement was the kind reserved for those considered high risk, but it came with an unintended cost. Derek, still a child, found himself in an environment that did not offer the emotional or psychological support he so desperately needed. The fact that he was a middle schooler, still playing with Legos, only emphasized how out of place he was in the grim reality of the juvenile justice system. He was removed from everything familiar, from his education to any opportunity for social interaction, forced into near-total isolation. It wasn't just punishment, it was a form of trauma. His education was halted, and he was deprived of any meaningful rehabilitation. So Derek's defense attorney, the renowned Jose Baez, immediately began raising concerns. Baez argued that Derek, due to his age, was not just a victim of his actions, but also of a system that wasn't equipped to handle a child like him. He demanded proper rehabilitation and therapy, pushing for Derek to be transferred to a more supportive juvenile facility where he could receive counseling and education. But this wasn't about excusing Derek's crime. It was about ensuring that he could eventually reintegrate into society as a reformed individual, not as someone permanently broken by the harshness of the justice system. Derek's family became the most vocal supporters of his defense. They rallied for him, demanding that he not be treated like an adult, but as the child, he still was. A family member was quoted saying, "He is not an adult. He is a child who still plays." For them, the emotional pain of losing Irina was compounded by the sense that Derek, too, was a victim. But not everyone saw it that way. The prosecution stood firm in its stance, arguing that Derek's actions, while committed by a child, were the actions of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. They described Irina's murder as evil, highlighting the calculated nature of the crime, 46 stab wounds, and maintained that Derek needed to face the consequences of his actions. They insisted that Derek's current confinement, while harsh, was necessary for public safety. The prosecution made it clear that his isolation was a precaution, not just for his safety, but to ensure that he did not harm anyone else in the future. The judge overseeing the case was forced to navigate these conflicting perspectives. While the judge agreed that Derek's confinement was necessary for his safety, they also ordered bi-weekly updates on his treatment. Meanwhile, Derek's defense team managed to secure a small victory. They were granted limited access to the crime scene, 3 hours inside the apartment where the murder had occurred. This access was crucial for the defense to gather their own evidence, to assess the scene where the tragedy had unfolded. They brought in a forensic examiner and a photographer to document the conditions of the room, hoping to find something that might offer more insight into Derek's state of mind during the murder. Despite the defense's efforts, delays continued to plague the case. Derek's trial was initially scheduled to begin on February 26, 2024, but a critical delay hindered its progress. Evidence, including body camera footage, results from physical evidence like the broken knife fragment and the blood-stained clothing Derek had worn, had not yet been turned over to the defense. The prosecution claimed that the evidence had only recently been sent to the lab, but the judge was frustrated by the delay, criticizing the prosecution for not having provided the evidence sooner, especially given the complexity of the case.
And a 13-year-old boy accused of murdering his own mother back in court on Thursday.
For the first time ever, we heard his chilling confession to detectives. Janine Stanwood is in Miami with new details in this case.
I woke up, I went to the kitchen, I grabbed one of the kitchen knives, and then I went to our room, and then I ate. It's okay, you can say I killed him.
The chilling interrogation video played in court. 13-year-old Derek Rosa allegedly confessing to brutally stabbing his mother, Irina Garcia, to death, and that he considered killing himself afterwards, but changed his mind. Family members in the gallery are sobbing.
Your mom sleeping? Yes, she was sleeping.
Surveillance stills released by the state attorney's office show what appears to be the teen standing over her bed, gripping a knife.
Did you tell her anything before you stabbed her? Were in Spanish.
Were there wounds to her face?
Yes.
The homicide detective in this case detailing not only the victim's 46 stab wounds, but Rosa's reported actions leading up to the brutal crime.
Yes, on October 12 at 6 p.m., he did make searches on Google. Okay. He typed in the word, the carotid artery image diagram. What is the best place to stab someone? Is a small knife good for killing?
This hearing is to determine whether Rosa should be held in a juvenile-only facility as he awaits trial. A corrections corporal testified that because Rosa is a high-profile inmate, he's kept alone in his cell and supervised 24 hours a day. A psychologist says the teen has ADHD and that another doctor tested him on the autism spectrum and that Rosa was suicidal.
As of August 2025, there was still no new trial date, and the delays continued to mount. Derek's family remained in despair, grieving the loss of Irina, yes, but also struggling to understand what had become of Derek, the boy they once knew. Also, the mounting legal fees, the need for experts to analyze evidence, and the costs of legal representation weighed heavily on the family, but they weren't backing down. They had created a fundraising page, which drew support from over 5,900 donors, raising nearly $150,000 to cover the legal costs. Despite the chaos, one thing remained clear. Derek's family still loved him. They saw his actions as a tragic mistake, a misguided decision made by a child who needed help, not a life sentence. They continued to pray for his rehabilitation, hoping against hope that he might one day be given a second chance at life. But the questions that lingered were ones that couldn't be easily answered. Why did Derek do it? What could have led him to kill his mother so violently? In the end, the biggest question remained. Should a child who had stabbed his mother to death be given a second chance? Some say yes, arguing that Derek's youth and potential for change should be considered. Others say no, believing that the horror of what he had done could never be excused, regardless of his age. The legal system, much like Derek's family, found itself torn between these two perspectives. Only time would tell if Derek would ever get the second chance his family believed he deserved. So, what do you think about this case? Should a child who commits such a brutal crime be given a second chance at life? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And if this video gripped you, be sure to like it, Share your thoughts and subscribe for more true crime stories like this. See you in the next video and stay safe.
I want him punished for what he did to me, because I honestly feel he's taken 20 years of my life away.
Now, a victim of the serial rapist David Carrick has told Sky News he used his job as a firearms officer to gain her trust before subjecting her to months of physical and mental abuse, telling her the safest place you can be is with me. Now, Carrick was formally discharged from the Metropolitan Police earlier today, and Sky News has obtained footage filmed by Carrick as he walked around his home in which he attacked many of his victims.
David Carrick, a name that once stood for authority, protection, and trust within the Metropolitan Police, was arrested on a seemingly ordinary October day in 2021. But the arrest itself was just the beginning of an even darker story. What followed wasn't just the end of his career as a police officer, it was the shocking revelation of a man who, for nearly 2 decades, used the very badge that was meant to protect the public to hide a trail of horror and abuse. But Carrick wasn't an ordinary officer. He had been assigned to protect some of the most powerful people in the country, guarding diplomats, ministers, and the halls of the British Parliament itself. But behind that uniform, he manipulated women, exploited his position, and committed heinous crimes, all while hiding in plain sight. Now, as we peel back the layers of his past, we begin to understand the terrifying reality of his actions and the disturbing extent of the damage he caused. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more, thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. David Carrick was born on January 4th, 1975, in Salisbury, England, into a family that was shaped by the complexities of military life. His father, a veteran of the armed forces, had a significant influence on the family's dynamic. Because of his father's service, the family moved frequently, living on different army bases across the country. This environment, though structured, was anything but stable. David's father was described as a heavy drinker, and it was here that the foundation for a troubled upbringing began to form. According to David, his father wasn't just a source of instability, he was abusive. David would later claim that the abuse was both physical and emotional, a dark aspect of his childhood that seemed to shape his view of authority and power. However, David's mother, Jean, denied these allegations, maintaining that their family life was normal and that David's memories of these experiences might have been exaggerated over time. But the difficulties didn't stop there. As David entered his teenage years, the family dynamic became even more complicated. His mother remarried, and with that came a new figure in David's life, his stepfather. David again claimed that he was subjected to abuse by this new man in his life. He said that his stepfather's treatment of him was harsh, possibly even more damaging than what he had endured from his biological father. Yet, once again, David's mother denied these accusations, insisting that David's relationship with his stepfather was no different from that of any other teenager. Despite these turbulent family relationships, David's outward life seemed to offer more promise. His mother described him as normal. He did well in school, participated actively in sports, and was considered a charming and popular figure among his peers. David had a natural talent for athletics, and he found a particular passion in martial arts. By the time he was a teenager, he had earned a black belt in Taekwondo, and his family would often attend tournaments to watch him compete. David was athletic, disciplined, and competitive, traits that his friends and family admired. One of his old schoolmates even recalled how cool David was at school, saying he was the kind of guy who had no trouble making friends and was highly sought after by girls. His social life seemed to match his athletic achievements. As David navigated through adolescence, he quickly gained a reputation as a charming young man who was good at everything he tried. This popularity among his peers, especially with girls, made him feel even more powerful, reinforcing a sense of superiority that would later become dangerous. At just 14 years old, David Carrick's life would shift dramatically after a serious allegation made by his mother. The details of the incident remain unclear, but the accusation pointed to a potential sexual assault. something that would eventually be reported to the police. However, no charges followed, and the case was left without further legal action. Despite this, the event left a deep mark on David. According to him, this was the turning point. The incident changed his behavior. It wasn't an immediate change, but over time, David became more withdrawn, retreating from his family and the relationships he once held close. Then, there were the troubling allegations from David's younger half-brother. On several occasions, David would kick him, causing serious injuries. Then, at the age of 19, David Carrick took a significant step in his life by joining the British Army. It wasn't just a desire to serve his country that drew him in, but rather a yearning for adventure. According to his mother, David's motivations were driven by the prospect of traveling and, perhaps more tellingly, the allure of having a weapon, a gun. This desire for power and control, even at such a young age, would later become a central theme in his life. He was initially posted to the Gloucestershire, Berkshire, and Wiltshire Regiment, where he would begin his military career, showing promise as a soldier. However, in 1997, David's path took another turn. He transferred to the Royal Logistics Corps, a decision that seemed to solidify his commitment to the military. This move marked a further deepening of his involvement, as he remained in the Army for several more years, adapting to the structured life of a soldier and gaining more responsibility with each passing year. On the surface, it seemed like he was building a solid career, but in reality, his motivations were still steeped in a desire for dominance and control. The Army, with its strict hierarchy and access to weapons, was an environment where David could feed into this craving for power. Yet, by 2000, just a few years into his military career, David made the decision to leave the Army. The reasons for his departure were unclear, and no formal disciplinary actions were recorded. However, this decision to leave the Army was followed by a series of troubling incidents that would raise red flags for those who knew him. In the year 2000, David found himself at the center of two significant allegations. The first was a report of malicious communications towards a partner, a case that pointed to an unhealthy and manipulative relationship. The second was a burglary accusation, one that, much like the earlier allegations in his youth, would go unaddressed by the authorities. These two early instances were the second major record of troubling behavior, but despite being reported to the police, no charges were filed and no criminal action was taken. Then, in August 2001, at the age of 26, David Carrick walked into the Metropolitan Police Service, wearing a uniform that represented trust, integrity, and public duty. Despite his troubling past and the unresolved allegations that had shadowed his teenage years and early adulthood, he was accepted into one of the most respected institutions in the United Kingdom. At the beginning of his career, David worked as a response officer in Merton, southwest London. His role required him to respond to emergencies, calm tense situations, and reassure the community. On the surface, he appeared to be effective. He earned the trust of both his colleagues and the public, presenting himself as reliable, competent, and dependable. But underneath that facade, the darker aspects of his character continued to exist, hidden from the eyes of his peers. As the years went by, David built a reputation for reliability, and his career began to advance. In 2009, he achieved a significant promotion when he was transferred into the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, a highly specialized unit responsible for protecting government buildings, embassies, and senior political figures. This was a position of prestige and enormous responsibility, and it brought him closer to the heart of British power. He carried firearms, stood guard at embassies, and was trusted to protect some of the most recognizable faces in politics. Among those he was tasked to protect was Boris Johnson, who at the time was the mayor of London. What made this rise in his career even more disturbing was how easily he blended in. And yet, those who interacted with him on a personal level, particularly women, began to see glimpses of the real David Carrick. His charm, his position, and his confidence drew them in, but the uniform and the badge also gave him an aura of untouchable authority. It was here, in the very early stages of his police career, that the dangerous pattern began to take root. David realized that the same uniform that made him look like a hero to the public also gave him the perfect disguise for his manipulation and cruelty. David Carrick's descent into terror began almost immediately after he joined the Metropolitan Police. The victims would eventually be known, but their stories were not heard for years. According to legal records, there are 12 victims whose cases were officially documented, but many others, too afraid or too silenced, likely went unreported. For the sake of clarity, these victims will be referred to by letters in the records, though their experiences were all too real, and the pain they endured was unimaginable. David's first known assault, which set the stage for everything that followed, occurred in 2003, just 2 years after he became a police officer. His first victim, referred to here as T, was a 20-year-old woman he met at a bar. What seemed like an innocent invitation turned into a horrifying ordeal. The two exchanged pleasantries, and David, ever the charming officer, invited her to a housewarming party. But there was no party. When T arrived at his flat, confusion quickly turned into dread. The door closed behind her, and the moment she stepped inside, everything changed. The housewarming party was a ruse, an excuse to lure T into a situation where he could carry out his horrifying plans. David held her captive in his flat for hours. He threatened her with a replica gun, making her believe her life was in danger. He used violence to overpower her, inflicting repeated sexual assault. T's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as David showed no sign of stopping. When he was finally done, he allowed her to leave, but the damage had been done. T went straight to A&E, bloodied and bruised, seeking medical help. But instead of compassion, she received something far worse. The nurse who treated her made a chilling remark. She told T that the perpetrator was a police officer, and in her words, it was unlikely that any action would be taken. This was the first time that David's abuse was dismissed, but it wouldn't be the last. And David Carrick's ability to manipulate and control continued. Just a year later, in 2004, he met M, a fellow officer, and began a flirtation that seemed harmless enough at first. What started as casual banter soon escalated when David, ever the predator, pushed the boundaries. He invited M to his flat, and what was supposed to be a consensual encounter soon turned violent. M, a fellow police officer, objected when David attempted to force himself upon her, but he ignored her pleas. It was the same pattern, the disregard for consent, the manipulation of power, and the unrelenting belief that no one would challenge him. M, like T, found herself trapped in a situation that got out of her control. The aftermath of the assault was devastating for M. Not only did she have to contend with the trauma of the assault itself, but the shame of being attacked by a fellow officer. She kept silent, burying her pain for years, unable to come forward. But something happened the following year that could have changed everything. In 2005, David Carrick completed mandatory domestic abuse training as part of his ongoing professional development within the Metropolitan Police. This training was supposed to equip officers with the necessary skills to recognize the signs of domestic violence and to support victims effectively. It focused on identifying patterns of abusive behavior, understanding the psychological toll on victims, and, most importantly, how to respond with compassion and support. However, for David, this was far from the turning point it should have been. Instead of using what he'd learned to reflect on his own actions, the training seemed to have no impact on him, and the following years, he would only get worse. By 2008, David Carrick was 33 years old when he began a relationship with F, a 20-year-old woman who would later go on to become a police officer herself. The age gap was significant, but Carrick's charm and his position in law enforcement drew her in. At first, the relationship seemed serious. He was her first real partner, and they even purchased a 2-story home together. But behind closed doors, what started as affection quickly descended into systematic abuse. Carrick isolated F from her friends and family, making her feel trapped and powerless. In one terrifying moment, he grabbed a knife and began slashing her police work shirts. It wasn't just an act of destruction. It was a calculated move to intimidate her, to threaten her professional life, and to make her believe that if she ever exposed him, he could ruin her completely. F later admitted she felt she had no way out. She believed no one would believe her, not even her colleagues, because Carrick was a fellow officer. Outside of their home, Carrick also showed his darker side in public. Friends later recalled how heavily he drank and how he became aggressive when he did. He started arguments in bars, flashed his police identification to intimidate people, and made it clear he enjoyed the power his position gave him. He was not just an abuser behind closed doors. He was a bully in every arena of his life. The following year, 2009, Carrick's pattern continued when he met S at a martial arts class. At first, he used the same charm and confidence that had lured in so many others. After a night of socializing and drinking, S agreed to go back to his home. She expected a consensual encounter, But once they were alone, Carrick's demeanor shifted. He became aggressive, rushing her, pinning her to the bed, and forcing himself on her despite her protests. When she resisted, Carrick's anger only deepened. He attempted to penetrate her, but when he couldn't perform, his frustration turned into rage. From that night on, whenever Carrick saw her in public, he hurled abuse at her, shouting insults and humiliating her. For S, the assault was compounded by harassment that never seemed to stop. Yet, like others before her, she felt trapped in silence. Reporting him felt impossible. He was a police officer and she believed that no one would take her word against his. Not long after, Carrick targeted another woman, D, whom he met during a night out. They shared drinks, and when she became emotional, Carrick positioned himself as a comforting friend, but once again, his true nature emerged. Instead of ensuring she got home safely, he manipulated her into going back to his flat. D made it clear she was not interested in a casual relationship, but Carrick ignored her boundaries. Once they were alone, he stripped and forced his fingers inside her, showing the same disregard for consent he had displayed before. Then, in 2009, David attended his school reunion, a night that would unknowingly set the stage for his next act of violence. There, he reconnected with N, a married woman he had known from his past. After spending time socializing, David convinced her to share a bed with him, as they had once been friends. At the time, N believed that sharing a bed was a harmless act. She saw no reason to doubt him, especially as he was a police officer and seemed trustworthy. But what was supposed to be a friendly gesture quickly turned disturbing. As N lay in bed, expecting to sleep, David began to make advances on her. She recoiled in horror and denied him access, but David didn't stop. Instead, he became increasingly aggressive. He grabbed her and dragged her back to his bed, whispering in her ear, "This will be our little secret." What followed was an assault that left N feeling both physically and emotionally violated. David forced himself upon her in a way that demonstrated the full extent of his manipulative nature. And then, as time passed, David's confidence grew. By 2015, he was well aware of the power his badge afforded him, and he wielded it with increasing arrogance. He reconnected with Kay, a woman he had known years earlier. David used his charm and his status in the police force to lure Kay into a brief but violent relationship. At first, Kay believed that she had met a trustworthy man, someone who had been kind to her, but things quickly escalated. David's true nature soon emerged. What started as a consensual encounter turned into a violent assault when David ignored Kay's objections. Despite her attempts to stop him, David disregarded her pleas and subjected her to excruciating pain. But even though Kay had experienced this horrifying abuse, the fear of reporting a police officer, especially one of David's stature, kept her from speaking out. David, however, was not finished, and as time passed, he would find his next victim. In 2016, David's web of manipulation and control ensnared B, a woman who had recently come out of an unhappy marriage. Vulnerable and seeking stability, B met David, and once again, he used his charm to draw her in. They began a relationship, and David quickly convinced her to move in with him. He even reassured her by offering to pay her £1,000 a month, further cementing his control over her. B was vulnerable, and David knew exactly how to exploit that. David's control soon extended far beyond financial manipulation. He isolated B from her family and friends, systematically cutting off her support system to make her more dependent on him. He even went so far as to monitor her when she worked from home, installing cameras in their shared living space. The constant surveillance was just one tool in his arsenal of intimidation. Then, David forced B to have sex shortly after she had undergone surgery to remove hemorrhoids. Despite her protests and the pain she was in, David pushed forward, showing no regard for her suffering. It wasn't just physical violence. He humiliated her in front of her daughter, leaving the child to overhear some of the assaults. The trauma B experienced was not just personal, it was now impacting her family too. As the months passed, B became a shell of the person she once was, yet, despite the devastation, B feared speaking out. She was aware of David's position within the police force and knew that her complaints would likely go unheard. So, she remained trapped as the years rolled on, with David's manipulative grip tightening. By 2017, David Carrick's confidence as a predator had reached terrifying new heights. That year, he met Jay while socializing, and at first, he drew her in with the same charm and authority that had deceived so many women before her. She saw a police officer, someone respectable, and someone she could trust. But within months, that illusion collapsed, and Carrick had gained near total control over her life. He dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, and even what she ate. He insulted her constantly, reducing her self-esteem until she no longer recognized herself. And because he always reminded her that he was the police, she lived in the crushing fear that no one would believe her word over his. But Carrick didn't stop at psychological control. He weaponized his job to terrify her. He sent her pictures of his firearm from work, attaching messages like, "Remember, I'm the boss." He used his police baton to threaten her. And when she resisted, he escalated further, handcuffing her, whipping her, and even locking her naked in a cupboard under the stairs for hours. Sometimes she suffered panic attacks in the dark, begging to be released, but he ignored her cries and taunted her from the other side of the door, whistling as if it were a game. Jay endured repeated sexual assaults so violent that she often bled afterwards. On one occasion, while they were on holiday, Carrick attacked her inside a tent. He forced himself on her while her parents slept just meters away in the next tent. To silence her, he covered her mouth, leaving her unable to call for help, even as her father grew suspicious and came to check. Carrick humiliated Jay in degrading ways, forcing her to endure acts that stripped away her dignity, even urinating on her as a form of control. The emotional scars became unbearable, and the trauma seeped into every aspect of her life. For nearly 2 years, she lived under his rule, believing escape was impossible. Yet when she finally broke free, she carried with her the whip Carrick had once used against her, determined to ensure that no other woman would suffer as she had. Even while absing Jay, Carrick was already hunting for more victims. His appetite for domination had grown insatiable, and between 2018 and 2019, 2 more women, W and P, fell into his trap. W was a cleaner who had agreed to work for him. Carrick reassured her by saying he was a police officer, even claiming to have run background checks on her. This display of authority made her feel like she had nothing to fear. But one day, as she cleaned his shower, Carrick stripped naked, cornered her, and assaulted her in a degrading way. W was left shaken and powerless, realizing that her supposed client, a man who should have represented safety, had turned her workplace into a crime scene. At the same time, Carrick targeted P, a vulnerable woman who struggled with learning difficulties and mental health issues. He pretended to be charming at first, making her feel wanted, but when alcohol loosened his mask, his cruelty exploded. He began referring to her as his slave, a term he used to strip away her humanity and remind her of her place beneath him. Carrick's assaults on P were relentless and sadistic. He forced oral sex on her until she vomited, an act that seemed to excite him. He urinated on her body and into her mouth, reducing her to an object of humiliation. On other occasions, he inserted large objects inside her, inflicting severe pain, then shoved her into the shower to continue his acts. Like J and W before her, P felt trapped. Carrick's police badge wasn't just a shield for his crimes, it was a weapon, convincing his victims that they had no chance of being believed if they dared to speak. By early 2020, David Carrick had already left a trail of broken lives behind him, yet he showed no sign of slowing down. That February, he met F, a woman who had recently moved to the UK. She saw him as respectable, safe, and dependable, because once again, Carrick leaned on the authority of his badge. But as soon as she moved in with him, the reality of who he was became terrifyingly clear. Carrick turned aggressive, and he reminded her constantly that her immigration status made her vulnerable. He threatened to report her to authorities if she disobeyed him, using fear as another weapon of control. Then the assaults began. The first time he attacked her, she cried out in pain and begged him to stop, but Carrick ignored her pleas, leaving her injured and bleeding, while dismissing her suffering as if she were exaggerating. Over and over, he forced himself on her, overpowering her resistance, degrading her further with acts meant not only to hurt, but to humiliate. Like so many before her, F was subjected to oral assaults that left her sick and terrified, while Carrick urinated on her body as though her dignity meant nothing. By July of 2020, she finally broke free, but her ordeal would become pivotal because she joined the small circle of women who later stood in court to testify against him. She became one of the 12 known victims whose voices cut through decades of silence. The moment that finally shattered Carrick's double life came in October 2021. A new allegation, this time unrelated to the known victims, was reported, and the police were forced to act. When officers arrived at his home, body cam footage recorded the arrest of one of the Metropolitan Police's own firearms officers.
These are the necessities that I've just explained to you.
No necessities. Well, keep going.
Well, that's one of three, one of four. So, okay. Well, I'll allow you to get some clothes.
What is it you're searching for?
Articles relating to the offences
happened in St Albans
in 2020. This is the allegation that's been made to us. Okay, sir.
There's no necessity.
Yes, there is.
So I've been a police officer for 20 years.
Right. David,
do you want me to come naked like this?
No, just understand you're under arrest, okay?
I'm under
just
arrest.
explain to us, what do you need?
I'll pull out like this. Don't worry about it.
Can one of my colleagues go and get you stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to? Yeah. Which one's yours?
The arrest made headlines instantly. The idea that a serving officer had been accused of such crimes sparked outrage, and it gave many of his former victims the courage to finally come forward. The trial became a turning point, not only for Carrick's victims, but also for the Metropolitan Police and the public's trust in it.
In many ways, this is a story of the strength of 12 women.
Okay.
When this arrest made the news in 2021, those impacted started to come forward.
Stand up, David Carrick.
His name, the one name stated clearly. The names of the women he attacked, out of legal necessity for their own protection, became letters of the alphabet. But Justice Chima Grubb made it clear that these women are not to be diminished.
These women are not weak or ineffectual. They were victims of your criminal mindset. The malign influence of men like you in positions of power stands in the way of a revolution of women's dignity.
During her sentencing, the judge described how David Carrick took monstrous advantage of women. In stomach-churning detail, she spoke of the crimes that he committed against 12 women over a 17-year period. They include rape, false imprisonment, indecent assault, attempted rape, coercive and controlling behaviour, and so much more. To Stevenage, where he lived. His home, now a map of his crimes. He'd stand and whistle outside this cupboard, after locking a woman inside, naked. This whip, a weapon that left welts on one survivor. When she escaped, she took it with her to stop him from harming other women. And he set cameras up to monitor his targets, watching their every move from wherever he was.
Prosecutors painted a picture of sustained, calculated actions. They detailed how Carrick had used his badge to terrify women into silence, how he had assaulted them while laughing at their fear, and how he had manipulated the system to remain untouchable. Inside the courtroom, Carrick offered little. He claimed a difficult childhood, but it did nothing to explain away years of deliberate cruelty. At one point, after an apparent suicide attempt, he was assessed for psychiatric issues. Doctors concluded he was not mentally ill. His violence was not born of illness or confusion. It was the product of entitlement, power, and control. In the end, the verdict was clear. The jury heard the stories, weighed the evidence, and found Carrick guilty of some of the most appalling offenses ever committed by a serving officer in modern British history. And as the judge prepared to hand down one of the rarest sentences in the UK, a whole life order, the full scale of Carrick's betrayal came into focus. In February 2023, David Carrick finally faced the full weight of the law. After nearly 2 decades of abuse, manipulation, and violence, he was handed 36 life sentences for a staggering 49 offenses, including multiple rapes, assaults, and acts of coercive control.
I've made ancillary orders for deprivation pursuant to Section 153 of the Sentencing Act 2020 and restraining orders under Sections 359 and 360 of the Act. They will remain in force until further order. The victim surcharge applies. I make no sexual harm prevention orders given the nature of the sentence I am about to pass. On the main indictment on counts 16, 19, 29, 30, 31, 32, 38, 39, 42 and 43, the sentence is 4 years imprisonment on each concurrent. On counts 24 and 25, the sentence is 7 years on each concurrent. On count 6, on the second indictment, I impose a concurrent determinate sentence of 9 years. 31 sentences of life imprisonment are imposed on the main indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, 26, 27, 28, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 40 and 41. Also, 5 life sentences are imposed on the second indictment on counts 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years.
The judge imposed a minimum term of 30 years, a sentence so severe it placed Carrick among the most dangerous offenders in modern British criminal history. His crimes were described in court as a campaign of rape and degradation carried out with planning, cruelty, and an almost chilling lack of remorse.
Home, you'd reasonably assess a private place for personal matters. But it begs the question, doesn't it? When you sign up to become a police officer, you sign up to a certain set of values and standards, a code of conduct that applies both on and off duty. And if David Carrick didn't have that compass to begin with, how did he end up serving within the ranks of a police force?
So what next? How much more of a knock can public trust take? In 2005, Carrick did a police training course on domestic abuse. By that point, he'd been in the force 4 years and raped multiple women undetected. His timeline exposes many missed opportunities.
He should not have been a police officer. There were many signs that we should have joined together. He should have been rooted out during his career as a police officer.
But he wasn't. Again today, the Commissioner promised change. And the Home Secretary said she looks forward to the findings of an inquiry into Carrick's behaviour, which is also looking into Sarah Everard's murder.
I believe we actually need a royal commission to decide the future of policing, because the system is so rotten, public trust has fallen so far, that tinkering around the edges is not going to cut it.
The details of Carrick's attacks are so violent, his cruelty deeply upsetting. He'll serve a minimum of 30 years in prison. And a final message for the women.
The court salutes the courage of all the victims and their families, and I hope they're able to thrive in the rest of their lives.
So what do you think about this case? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. We read every single one of them. And if you found this story important, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime investigations that uncover the darkest secrets behind the headlines. Until next time, stay safe, look out for one another, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Please beware. This is one of the most gruesome cases we've ever covered on this channel. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, November 24th, 1998, in the quiet Finnish town of Hyvinkää, a man drove out to the Capula landfill to drop off his trash. But as he dumped his bags onto a newly arrived mound of waste, something strange caught his eye. It looked like a mannequin's leg, pale, rigid, half buried in the snow-dusted garbage. He stepped closer, then he stopped cold. Because it wasn't plastic, it wasn't fake, it was a real human leg. The man backed away, shaking, and he called the authorities immediately. Within the hour, police and forensic pathologists had arrived at the site. The landfill was sealed off. The body part was carefully lifted from the waste and examined under the cold gray sky. The leg was intact, skin, muscle, bone, leg hair still visible. The signs were clear. Someone had been killed. But who? There was no torso, no hands, no face, and no identification. Just a single severed limb left to rot among discarded furniture, broken glass, and food wrappers. The landfill didn't just serve Hyvinkää, it received garbage from more than 1 million people in the region. For investigators, the possibilities were endless and utterly overwhelming. So they started digging, and what they found next was so disturbing, so beyond anything the country had seen before, that the Finnish government sealed the entire case from the public, sealed it until the year 2038, because even in a country known for peace and order, no one was prepared for what came out of that apartment in Hyvinkää, not the police, not the press, and not the people. And once you hear what really happened, you'll understand why. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. It was just past midday on November 24th, 1998, when a man pulled up to the Kupula landfill on the outskirts of Hyvinkää and saw the horrible scene. Forensic pathologist had determined that it belonged to an adult, almost certainly male. But that landfill wasn't just Hyvinkää's backyard. It served over 1 million residents across southern Finland. The leg could have come from anywhere. So the police did the only thing they could. They started digging. They brought in cadaver dogs trained to sniff out the faintest trace of human remains, and enlisted students from the National Police Academy to sift through the garbage, bucket by frozen bucket. A local military garrison even stepped in to guard the perimeter overnight, ensuring no tampering, no press intrusion, no contamination. It was winter, and the snow kept falling. Garbage froze in place. Rot and ice fused together. It was slow and grueling. Still, they searched. Then, 1 week later, they found it, a small, unrecognizable piece of flesh. At first glance, no one could tell what it was, just a shredded chunk of tissue. But lab results confirmed it, a section of the human stomach. From the same body, from the same victim. It was barely anything, but it was enough to begin painting a picture. Because when they analyzed that tissue, they found more than just DNA. They found a timeline, they found a lifestyle, and they found a clue no one expected. The rest of the body was gone. The killer had made sure of that. But the stomach held secrets, and it would tell police exactly what kind of life this person had lived and how he may have died. Lab technicians analyzed its composition, looking for anything, disease markers, traces of toxins, or indicators of time of death. But what they found first was alcohol, high levels of it. Enough to confirm that the victim had been heavily intoxicated at the time he died. That alone didn't tell the whole story, but the tissue also showed long-term damage, signs of chronic consumption. This wasn't someone who drank occasionally. This was someone who drank daily, possibly someone dependent. And that mattered because it gave investigators something to work with. They knew now they were looking for a young adult, most likely male, between 20 and 30 years old. Someone with a serious alcohol problem, someone likely struggling, and most importantly, someone who might have been living on the margins of society. In Finland, people facing that kind of hardship often relied on state assistance, so detectives turned to welfare records. They pulled names from the system, anyone who hadn't shown up to collect their monthly support, and then they started making calls. Most were accounted for, some had moved, some were in rehab, some had recently re-entered the workforce. But then, one name stood out, a 23-year-old man from the nearby town of Järvenpää. He hasn't claimed his last 2 payments, no medical records, no reported hospital stays, no travel, no notice to his landlord, and most telling, no missing persons report. No one had noticed he was gone. So officers drove to his listed address. It was a small flat in a quiet apartment block. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox was full, and the neighbors hadn't seen him in weeks. Inside, police found nothing alarming. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no mess, but also no life. His fridge was empty, his bed untouched. It looked like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Then came the DNA test. The results confirmed it. This man, unnamed to the public, was the one whose leg had been found at the landfill. He was the one whose stomach had told the story. He'd lived alone, he rarely left his apartment. He didn't have many friends, and his family, if they were still in contact at all, hadn't raised the alarm. He hadn't just died alone, he had vanished alone. And yet, as police dug deeper, they found that in the final days of his life, he hadn't been alone at all, in fact, the last time anyone saw him alive. he was in the company of 4 others, and every single one of them would soon be under arrest because he hadn't just disappeared, he'd crossed paths with the wrong crowd. But in the final hours before his death, he was surrounded by people, not strangers, people he knew, people he considered friends, and that's what made what happened next so difficult to comprehend. There were 5 of them that night. First, there was Jarno Sebastian Elg. He was 23 years old, born and raised in Hyvinkää, and from an early age, his life had spiraled. He struggled with mental illness, had a long history of substance abuse, and had been institutionalized multiple times. He didn't finish school, he didn't hold a job, and when he was 16, he tried to burn down a medieval church, an act inspired by the black metal movement that had swept through Scandinavia in the early 90s. He was arrested for arson and spent nearly 2 years in juvenile detention. By the time he met the others, he wasn't just isolated. He had come to see himself as something more, a teacher, a guide, a kind of self-made prophet. And at the center of his beliefs was Satanism, not worship in the traditional sense, but a personal philosophy of power, dominance, and absolute freedom from moral restraint. Then there was Terhi Johanna Tervashanka. She was just 17, a runaway, estranged from her family. She had started drinking in the 9th grade and quickly descended into addiction. She'd also been hospitalized for psychiatric care, and like LG, had spent time at Kelikoski Hospital. That's where they met, and from the moment they connected, she followed him, not just physically, mentally, emotionally. She absorbed his worldview and helped create the insulated echo chamber they would both live in. Next was Mika Christian Riska, 21 years old, quiet, withdrawn, also from the mental health system. He had minor offenses on his record, mostly drunken disturbances and vandalism, but nothing violent. He too had met Elg during treatment, and he too found something magnetic in Elg's presence. Elg didn't just talk about pain and power, he believed in it. Mika followed. Then came the youngest, a 16-year-old boy from Kerava. His name has never been made public. He was vulnerable, disconnected from family, and like the others, pulled into LG's orbit. And finally, the victim. He didn't dress like them, he didn't share their beliefs, but for reasons still unclear, he ended up in their company. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he felt accepted, or maybe he had no idea what they were truly capable of. But that night, he was with them. All 5 were dressed in black. All were heavily intoxicated, and all of them were wandering through the streets of Hyvinkää on a cold Saturday evening, November 21st, 1998. That's when they came across a group of young people standing outside a Pentecostal church. The church's youth group had launched an outreach effort to help teens struggling with alcohol. They were handing out tea, offering conversation, and hoping to make a difference in a town where youth drinking had quietly become a crisis. The 2 groups couldn't have been more different. The church group stood quietly, sober, clean-cut. The other group, led by Elg, reeked of booze and stared them down with smug defiance. And then Elg spoke out loudly and mockingly. He called Christianity a waste of time. He laughed at the idea of salvation. And he made sure they all knew. Satanism, he said, wasn't devil worship. It was freedom. It was power. And it didn't answer to anyone. For a moment, it seemed like something might happen. But eventually, both groups drifted away. The churchgoers returned inside, and Elg and his group headed to the train station. But the confrontation had lit a fuse, because that wasn't the last debate of the night. And the next one wouldn't end with words. Back at Jarno Elg's apartment, the group slipped into a familiar rhythm. That flat, small, dark, cluttered with skull-themed decor had become their haven. Their ritual ground. The windows were closed tight. The walls were lined with tapestries and posters of black metal bands. And in the corner, LG's stereo system sat ready, and he turned it on. The Canian Chronicle by Ancient filled the room, an album Elg held sacred. He said it gave voice to everything he believed in, to darkness, to power, and to rebellion. Everyone was drinking, substances were passed around, and the atmosphere turned heavy, fueled not just by intoxication, but by Elg's brooding silence. Then came a comment that changed everything. Male A, the quiet one, the one who didn't fully belong, casually said something about the music. That it wasn't very good, and that was just noise. It wasn't meant as an attack, but Elg's eyes went cold. Without a word, he stood up and punched him hard across the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The room went silent for a moment. But then, the 16-year-old joined in, kicking the man as he tried to rise. Terhi and the boy dragged him to the sofa, where the group took turns beating him. It escalated quickly, not in a burst of rage, but in something slower, more deliberate, as though each strike fed the next, as though cruelty itself had become a shared language. Elg left the room briefly, and when he returned, he wasn't holding a weapon, but something symbolic. A studded dog collar and a metal leash. They forced male A onto all fours, fastened the collar around his neck, and made him crawl across the room like an animal while they laughed. But it didn't stop there. They urinated on him, one by one. They caused lots of injuries on his body. He begged them to stop. He promised he wouldn't tell anyone, that he'd forget everything if they just let him go. But no one listened. If anything, his fear only seemed to enrage LG further. He grabbed a pair of scissors, walked over slowly, and without hesitation, began stabbing him in the head. Afterwards, they slumped him back onto the sofa, bleeding, dazed, broken, and debated what to do next. That's when Melee tried to escape. He made a break for the door, still bound and battered, but he didn't get far. They caught him and dragged him back inside. Elg, calm and calculated, told Terry to fetch something. She returned with a roll of duct tape. Together, they tied his wrists and ankles, binding him so tightly he couldn't move. Then, to keep him from screaming any further, they wrapped the tape around his head, covering his mouth, and unknowingly, his nose. He couldn't scream anymore, but he also couldn't breathe. Still, the group continued, beating him, taunting him, hurting him, unaware that he was dying beneath the tape. And by the time they noticed he had stopped moving, it was already too late. He was silent, and he was gone. But that didn't end it, because what they did next was even worse. Jarno Elg took out a knife, and Terhi fetched a pair of scissors, and together they began cutting open the body. This wasn't cleanup, this was butchery. Then came the head. It was cut off and tossed between them, passed from one hand to another. At one point, they laughed so hard they dropped it. The apartment had descended into something beyond cruelty, beyond madness. Then, Elg and Terhi sat down and ate him. They carved pieces from his body and consumed them. Not out of desperation, not for ritual, just because they could, and Mika joined in. Later in the night, someone, possibly Elg, gouged out Male A's eyes. And then, in what can only be described as a final act of desecration, they inserted firecrackers into the empty sockets. They lit them. And when they did, the skull exploded. The laughter didn't stop. The music never turned down. And the line between reality and nightmare had long been erased. By dawn, the high began to fade. The group sobered up, just enough to register the blood on the walls, the parts of a body scattered across the floor. But something was missing. The head. They searched the apartment, confused, checking closets and cupboards. Then someone opened a cabinet door, and there it was. Someone had stashed the head away during the night and forgotten. They thought it was hilarious. They found it funny that they could lose a head and not even realize it. But the cleanup hadn't started yet, because what came next was disposal. The apartment didn't smell like death. It reeked of bleach, stale beer, and blood that had soaked into the floors. By morning, Terhi Tervashanka was on her knees, scrubbing the wooden panels beneath the sofa. Jarno Elg hadn't stopped sawing. While she scrubbed, he was still in the bathroom, hunched over what was left of Male A, using a dull blade to break bone and sever flesh into smaller, more manageable pieces. Blood had splattered across the ceiling, clung to the walls, and puddled in the tile grooves. No room was clean. The entire apartment was a crime scene, top to bottom. But they weren't professionals. They weren't even trying to make sense of the horror they just committed. They were just reacting. Mika Riska and the 16-year-old boy had stepped outside. They'd walked into the cold morning air, maybe trying to escape the smell, maybe trying to clear their heads. And as they paced the streets of Hyvinkää, they made a decision. They'd scatter the body, cut it up, bag it, dump it piece by piece, bin by bin. Back at the apartment, Terhi was now scrubbing blood off the walls with what looked like a kitchen rag. Elg, still energized, kept cutting, and eventually black trash bags were pulled out. The group stuffed Male A's arms, legs, organs, and fragments of tissue into the plastic. They tied the bags tight and sealed them with duct tape. Dumpster after dumpster across the suburbs of Hyvinkää received their share. Bits of flesh, a partial torso, pieces of someone who, just days earlier, had been a living, breathing man. But the head, they kept. For reasons never fully explained, they stored it in a cupboard, like it was nothing more than leftovers from a night they never planned to repeat. Then they waited. Over the next few days, Elge and Terhi stayed glued to the TV. They flipped through channels, watched the local news, and laughed when the landfill story finally broke. A leg had been found, and they were thrilled. As the headlines flashed across the screen, and journalists speculated about the mystery limb, the killers sat in that blood-stained flat, smirking, high, and untouchable. But the landfill wasn't done giving up its secrets, and neither was Elg, because he couldn't stop himself from watching or from talking. And very soon, someone would talk back. As the police continued their investigation about who the victims spent a lot of time with, the name Jarno Elg came up more than once. Witnesses said Elg often wandered the streets with a small group. They wore all black, kept to themselves, and drank hard. The 23-year-old victim, let's call him Male A, had been seen with them just days before he vanished. On December 8, 1998, police made their move. 4 people were arrested: Jarno Sebastian Elg, age 23, Mika Riska, age 21, Terhi Tervashanka, age 17, and the 16-year-old boy, whose name remains sealed by law. All were taken into custody, and the first place police searched was Elg's apartment. Inside the flat, investigators were hit with the smell first, then the visuals. At first glance, it looked like the home of a Gothic collector or a horror film fan. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't decoration. There were skull-shaped pendants, books about Satanism, a golden necklace etched with 666, and handwritten notes referencing the Satanic Bible. Knives with ornate handles were tucked behind furniture. Symbols were scratched into the woodwork. The entire apartment felt like a shrine to chaos. But that wasn't what shook the officers most. It was the DNA. Blood spatter had dried behind furniture, clung to the ceiling, and pooled beneath the floorboards. There were strands of human hair caught in the baseboards, and samples of skin stuck to dried patches on the bathroom wall. The evidence was overwhelming, biological, physical, and undeniable. So much so that some investigators began asking themselves, was this the only one? Could there be other victims? Was this just the crime they got caught for? Because the apartment didn't look like a one-time scene. It looked like a ritual site, used, stained, and lived in. But just as questions began to multiply, the suspects began to talk. And what they confessed next, no one was prepared to hear. The courtroom was silent when Jarno Sebastian Elg entered. But it wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect. It was the kind that followed disbelief. He walked in smirking, his hair long and unkempt, his frame thin but firm. And as he sat down, surrounded by lawyers and press, he raised both hands and threw up metal horns. For Elg, this was a stage, and he was performing. From the moment questioning began, he showed no remorse. In fact, he leaned into the horror. He told the court the murder wasn't senseless, according to him. It followed a strict code, a satanic code. And he listed the rules one by one. Don't give your opinion unless it's asked for. When in someone's lair, show them respect. If a guest in your home annoys you, show no mercy. Male A, Elg claimed, had broken all 3. He insulted the music, he disrespected the space, and that, according to Elg, justified what came next. The court also heard about something else. Something Elg had done just weeks before the murder when no one was watching. He had tied his dog to a radiator in his apartment, then beat it slowly to death with a metal pipe. Investigators later described it as a rehearsal, proof that Elg had been testing his capacity for cruelty and finding that it didn't bother him at all. It was a brief moment in the trial, but it changed the mood in the room. Because this wasn't about a drunken night gone wrong, it was about someone who had crossed a line long before he killed a man. The courtroom was already closed to the public. No cameras, no journalists. Only selected plea portions were made public. Everything else was sealed by the Finnish government. The brutality was simply too much, and the satanic panic at the time had reached such a height that officials feared widespread backlash if the full case were released. Still, some facts were made known, and so were the sentences. Jarno Elg was sentenced to life in prison. But in Finland, life didn't mean forever. He became eligible for parole after just 12 years. Terhi Tervashenko, only 17 at the time, was deemed partially insane. Psychiatric evaluation said she knew right from wrong, but her mental state was compromised. She was given 8.5 years. Mika Riska, who had helped torture the victim, helped dismember him, and took part in cannibalism, was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months. He was found guilty of assault, necrophilia, and improper disposal of a corpse. The 16-year-old boy, the youngest in the group, was released. The court ruled that he had been manipulated and coerced by the older members. His name was sealed permanently. After the sentencing, Finnish authorities made an unprecedented decision. The full case file would be sealed for 40 years. Until 2038, no one would know the victim's name. No public access to crime scene photos, no access to interrogation recordings, no trial transcripts beyond the sentencing phase. They said it was to protect the public, but others believed it was to protect Finland's sense of itself. Because what happened in that flat wasn't just murder, it was something darker, a ritual, a breakdown, and a warning. And despite the verdict, this wasn't the end. Not for Elg, not for Terhi, and not for the families that would soon cross their paths again. Jarno Sebastian Elg walked out of prison in 2016. He had served 17 years, just 5 more than the minimum required for life. In prison, he had completed several educational programs. He took courses, passed exams, and even started working full-time inside the system. So when parole was granted, officials said he had shown rehabilitative progress. But outside, things didn't stay quiet for long. He got into a bar fight while on supervised parole. He was intoxicated, loud, and uncooperative. The incident cost him his early privileges, but it wasn't enough to revoke parole entirely. Since then, he has remained off the radar, no new charges and no new arrests, just a man who left prison and disappeared into the background of Finnish society. However, Terhi Johanna Tervashenko's path was very different. She had been paroled in 2003 after serving barely 5 years. She was young, unstable, and diagnosed with partial insanity, and 4 years later, she snapped again. In 2007, she stabbed a 47-year-old man with a billhook, a curved blade used for cutting tree limbs. The blow was brutal, deliberate, and fatal. This time, there was no debate about her sanity. She was sentenced to another 10 years in prison. While incarcerated, she escaped in 2011. It wasn't a dramatic breakout, just a silent disappearance during a supervised release program. But the public backlash was swift. Authorities caught her days later. She had been smuggling, falsifying prescriptions, and forging ID documents under a false name. Eventually, she served her full sentence. And when she walked out again, she was older, she now lives in northern Finland, reportedly has a child, and has not been convicted of any new crimes since. But what's never changed is her silence about what happened that night in 1998. She never named the victim, never spoke of remorse. Only once, in an old interview, she claimed the death was an accident and that he had just been tied up and things went too far. So, what do you think about this case? We want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one of them. And if you found this case as disturbing and compelling as we did, don't forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe for more real true crime stories like this. There are more cases out there, buried, sealed, or silenced, and we're here to tell them.